All right, hello everybody who is attending AxCon from around the world. We apologize for the delays that we experienced, but our session is being recorded and will be available on demand for AxCon registrants. If you require live captions, click on the CC, the closed caption button at the bottom of the video player, or click on the transcription link, which is a bit further down the page below the video player. To ask a question, click on the button that says join the chat room, and then when the chat sidebar opens, select the questions tab and you can ask your questions there. So with that little bit of background information, I have the pleasure to introduce two of my highly esteemed colleagues, Wilco Fears and Glenda Sims. And both Wilco and Glenda have been deeply involved in the accessibility space for many, many years and have been highly influential in shaping international accessibility guidelines and standards. They are both very engaging and fantastic people, and I will turn the time over to you, Glenda and Wilco.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. So, Future of Accessibility Guidelines. I'm Glenda, Chief Information Accessibility Officer at DeQ, and I've been doing some volunteer work at the W3C. I also refer to myself as the Good Witch of Accessibility. Wilco, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Wilco Fierce. I'm Principal Product Owner of AxScore and Excellent for DQ Systems Europe. I'm based in the Netherlands. I do various things at the W3C, including project management for WCAG 3.0, and I'm a facilitator for the ACT, the Accessibility Conformance Testing Task Force.
Awesome. So our agenda is, are you ready for the biggest accessibility adventure ever? We're going to talk about the future of WCAG, accessibility guidance outside of WCAG, and future needs and opportunities. So future of WCAG. What's happening with WCAG 2.2? It's been published, and the W3C, starting in October of 2023, created a backlog task force because did you know there are 600 plus open issues asking questions for clarification and changes on WCAG 2.x? The great thing, this task force that was created by the Accessibility Guideline Working Group just got set up and really moving forward, I believe, in December. I was chatting with Mike Gower. They've already closed 80 issues successfully. 30 of them were simple, 50 were complex. And so thank you to the group that's providing those valuable answers. Big question, I bet all of you are wondering, is will there be a WCAG 2.3, a 2.4, a 2.5? What do I think? If I look at the charter for the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, that charter just started in November and it runs through October 31st of 2025. The primary objective is to do what? Publish one or more wide review drafts of WCAG 3.0. There are some options if they feel the need to go to a 2.3 as a transitional document. But I'll tell you from what I am seeing right now, the efforts are very much focused on the original objective WCAG 3.0. So I think, well, I'll tell you what I think in a little bit. And someone may ask, why isn't WCAG 3 ready yet? And to that, I want to say, you know, building WCAG 3.0 takes more time than you would expect. It needs to be inclusive, research-based, applicable worldwide, future-proof, tech-agnostic. It's really complex. It's applied in laws, even though it was originally intended to just be a guideline. It's applied in laws. And it needs to ethically meet people with disabilities needs. So unless you've ever tried to do this before, I'll tell you, it really does take time to do this. The structure of WCAG 3, the way it's shaping up right now, if we look at WCAG 2, we had principles, guidelines, and success criteria as three top main pieces. Over in WCAG 3, the proposal is to drop principles because it's too, I think, limiting to have the principles. There's good concept, but from a structural information architecture, it was too limiting. To keep the guidelines, but then at the success criteria to call them outcomes. So the new word for success criteria, or what we've been used to using success criteria for, will be outcomes in 3.0. And then there are some other pieces in 3.0, methods instead of techniques, critical issues instead of non-interference requirements, and a proposal for bronze, silver, and gold instead of level A, double A, and triple A. None of this is set in stone yet. This is just what we're seeing right now in early drafts. You may wonder, what is the progress on WCAG 3.0 guidelines and outcomes? I'm excited to report that there's been great progress. There are 211 draft outcomes. Remember, outcomes are the new success criteria in the 3.0 world. What do those outcomes include? When you get a copy of this presentation, you'll be able to click in and read those draft outcomes. They include the goodness of everything that you know and want to keep from WCAG 2.2, and adds new goodness that wasn't possible in the old 2.0 structure. And then the guideline information architecture is being built right now based on card sorting to create default organization of outcomes. It's super fun to be involved at this stage and see what the W3C is doing. It's a very open, transparent process, and you, if you want to, can get involved in. If you were sorting the 211 outcomes into categories, what categories would you sort them into? That's the stage they're at right now. They've created emergent categories. They've done an analysis of information architecture categories, and they're now at the recommended category stage, all still in draft. Everything could still change, but lots of delicious progress. Okay, so we know there are these outcomes and they're going to be organized. How are we going to make sure they're testable in 3.0? And also meeting the needs that haven't been met in 2.x for things like cognitive. We're going to see quantitative objectives for outcomes, very similar to success criteria that we have in 2.x. Something that might be automatable or can be reliably and objectively tested manually. So we're going to continue to see that. And the cool new addition is qualitative assertions. Published claims that certain procedures were followed. It could include, I as an organization have an accountable person for accessibility, Chief Information Accessibility Officer, for example. A description of the procedure and how it was performed. It could be showing that usability testing was performed, training was completed. Much like when I think about driving, there are objective measurements for, am I speeding? If I'm doing the speed limit, am I a safe driver? Not necessarily, but it's a step in the right direction, and we can objectively measure how fast my car is going. And then qualitative, do I have a driver's license? So that's the kind of model that we're looking at, and I'm very optimistic that this is going to move us forward into areas that will help cognitive disabilities. And before we get to our predictions, I've got one more thing to add, and that is outcome format exploration. One of the goals of WCAG 3.0 is to make it easier to use and easier to understand. And so rather than just writing success criteria the way it was done in 1.0 or 2.x, they're looking at multiple different ways the outcomes or requirements could be written. Should it be a user statement or a needs statement or requirements? My favorite was the question. I didn't win that one though. Could it be a technical statement, passive or active? Or what about something else? So you can, when you get this presentation, click on the outcome format exploration and see examples of the initial 10 outcomes that have been written. Are these final? No, they're not final. We're under exploration. So Wilco, I've got some questions for you.
Sure, shoot.
WCAG 3 predictions. What do you think the timeline for WCAG 3 will look like? When do you think it'll be ready or finished?
Well, Glenna, like you mentioned, they're looking at over 200 outcomes. That's a lot of outcomes to write. Like something like 6 years seems like a long time, but if you think about that, that's 300 weeks, less. And 200 outcomes in 300 weeks, that's a pretty tall order, especially considering that you don't just need to write them. You need to have them thoroughly reviewed. You're going to have to go through multiple cycles of updates and public feedback and updates and public feedback. That's all a lot of work. So I think optimistically, 2030 is my bet for WCAG 3.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very hard to predict process too.
Yeah, yeah. I think it is hard to predict. And I hear where you're talking that if we were dependent on writing these one after another, it would be problematic. But I actually think that the accessibility guideline working group leadership is going to be able to have multiple streams of different outcomes being written at the same time. So I'm going to take your 2030 and play, I guess, The Price is Right and say it'll be finished before 2030. Are you willing to take my bet on that?
Sure thing.
Okay,
I'll take that bet.
We'll see who wins. So you and I have talked a lot about WCAG 3, and what if you were in charge of the world? How would you publish WCAG 3? Would you wait until it was all finished? Or would you like to publish it in phases or stages?
I think that largely depends on how much time it's going to take to do all of it. Given that we're looking at a complete rewrite, I very much expect it's going to take a long time. I think 6 years is plausible, but that's not even a guarantee. I think it could turn out to be more. And if that's the case, I think we would want to publish things early. So the working group is exploring a few ideas. One of the ones that's currently relatively popular is the idea of publishing certain parts of WCAG as modules. So you would finish a piece. Let's say you've written new guidance on video, audio description, captions, that kind of area. You could publish that as its own document, as a standalone update that people could start adopting, and publish a number of these modules as you go, so that over time, like, we release things early and we release things as we go. Some drawbacks to that too. It means once the thing's published, it's going to be pretty difficult to update it and fix it if you've got new ideas on how to do it better. But I think that's the way to release things before that very potentially very long timeline.
I hear you, and I think you're one of the smartest human beings I know, and I usually agree with you, and when I don't, it's because you often know something I don't know. But I'll tell you on this, I feel like you're approaching this from a software perspective, and this isn't software. This is requirements that get turned into law. And so for me, I'm shooting for the whole thing to be published. But I'm flexible and agile, just like, when our session didn't start on time. Let's be flexible and agile, but still get her done. I got one more question for you on predictions.
Sure.
What do you think about qualitative testing as part of WCAG 3? Do you think it's reasonable to have something like usability testing was completed as a requirement for WCAG 3?
I really like that idea. I think it has the potential to address a number of issues that are currently not getting addressed sufficiently in WCAG 2. I do think there's a pretty big caveat to that. It's what does that mean then exactly to do usability testing? A usability study with 10, 15 people is an expensive undertaking. You can, of course, cut that down, reduce that in significant ways, but then if everybody cuts that down, like how do you strike that balance? I think that's a difficult thing to get right. And I think to me, it seems reasonable to make that dependent on the type of website, the type of organization. And that's something that WCAG hasn't really explored in the past, and also feels something legislators might consider more than something that needs to be part of a standard.
Well, I'm excited to hear that you're open to the qualitative testing and assertions because I believed in it deeply. I remember when the Air Carrier Access Act came out, and there was one sentence in there, and it says, usability testing will be conducted with people with the following disabilities. I may not get the words exactly right, but tactile, visual, auditory, and there was one other, cognitive. And I thought, what's the use of that one sentence? And when I sat down with airline after airline after airline and did usability testing for them, just the fact that they were doing usability testing, I watched those organizations start to wake up to why accessibility mattered and not just trying to meet minimums. So I'm all about the assertions. For those of you following along, if you really prefer to read our predictions, I've written up a slide of when we think it's going to finish. And I believe that the drafts of WCAG 3 can be a great resource even before they're finalized. So that's why I'm very comfortable not going with the modules. Any other comments on our predictions, Wilco, before I hand it over to you to talk about other accessibility guidance?
Let's move on.
All right, let me move the slides forward and then I'm going to put you in control of slides.
Right, because if it is going to take 2030, 2032, who knows? There's a potentially large gap, and there's something you should know. There's a lot of accessibility related guidelines out there that is not WCAG. And I think it's worth looking at those and for everybody to explore those a little bit and try to understand what else is out there that isn't necessarily legally mandatory, but maybe it is, and what more you should know about. So one place to look at is Europe, where I'm at. And particularly EN 301549, that's Europe's standard on accessibility. And it includes WCAG, but it goes a good bit beyond WCAG 2. For example, there are guidelines on two-way voice communication and video capabilities within ICT systems. So that could potentially be web too. There's lots of technologies that have that, and there are guidelines that are potentially required within Europe that cover this. There are some guidelines for non-documents on captions positioning, on audio description timing. That's not part of WCAG. Certainly something to look at. Lots of organizations are going to need to deal with this. Software, including web, in the EN 301549 has a number of other requirements as well. The interoperability with assistive technologies is part of that. Documented accessibility uses, user preferences. So your accessibility settings in your browser, in your operating system might relate to that. There's requirements on authoring tools as well. So if you've got an authoring tool that you've built into your website, and that's potentially something as straightforward as a comment feature for your blog or your reviews or whatever. There are requirements for that. And those are all required currently under the Web Accessibility Directive, the WAD, that is legislation that applies across all of the EU, and it's applicable to government organizations. And coming very soon is the European Accessibility Act as well. And the European Accessibility Act is new legislation in Europe that's coming into force in June 2025, so a year from now. And it covered lots of things. It covers not just web, it covers computers and operating systems, smartphones, hardware. It covers services, banking services, e-commerce. And one of the things that is also part of that is the requirement to have an accessibility statement. This is potentially a really big thing. If you recall, Glenda, Europe has put out a number of big legislations that impacted the web everywhere. There was GDPR on privacy and use of data. There was the cookie pop-up legislation. We got cookie banners out of that for everywhere. This is one of those. This is potentially a very big and impactful legislation that's coming up very soon.
Exciting.
But yeah, I think you had another one for the US too, didn't you?
I do. So I'm going to move us forward and I'm going to go really super quickly over that due to our time. But Wilco and I were discussing, what is beyond WCAG? And I said, well, there's a bunch in 508. And he goes, really? What is it? My favorite section of 508 is the functional performance criteria. It's been there for years, continues in the current refresh. But does this thing work? Does this IT thing work without vision? Does it work with limited vision, without perception of color, without hearing, with limited hearing, without speech, with limited manipulation, with limited reach and strength, with limited language, cognitive, and learning abilities? And so it's the true test of, can a person have a possibility of using this? So I do love that piece that we can all pick up and use. And then I'm not going to go into detail, but just like you heard Wilco talking about in EN 301-549, Section 508 in the US has had a legal requirement for accessibility in software, covering things related to captions and audio descriptions and templates and exporting, making sure you don't lose the accessibility. And what else has to be accessible? The support documentation and services. So chapters 5 and 6 in 508 go beyond WCAG in a most delightful way.
There's
So
lots of other guidelines too. The W3C has an authoring tool accessibility guidelines. These are fairly widely known, but not particularly required anywhere. There are plain language guidelines that are well worth a read if you want to learn how to write web content better in a way that's more easily accessible to everybody. One of my personal favorites is the game accessibility guidelines. Personally, a bit of a gamer. But more importantly, I love the way these things are organized. They are well worth a read. I really appreciate them. A wickedly long document next is the audio description accessibility guidelines. Do you know there was audio description guidelines, Glenda?
I didn't, you taught me this one.
Yeah, it's a fascinating document. It's a really, really good read. And not accessibility, but I really wanted to mention it. The W3C, there's a good W3C community group, which has been developing web sustainability guidelines about sustainable and making sure that you don't use more energy in your web development than you need to.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. And I wanted to mention 3 great resources beyond laws and guidelines. I love making content usable for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. It is a W3 document. It's just not picked up by law the way WCAG is, and yet it is instantly accessible. I've used it in projects with wonderful organizations that wanted to make sure that things really were accessible now. The XR, AR, VR space is hot right now. And so if you aren't aware of xraccess.org, that's where the big brains are, and they love to share their tips for making things accessible. And last but not least, the W3C accessibility maturity model, because we can have these checklists of things you're supposed to do, but you also have to have the infrastructure beneath it, your policies, your guidelines, your training, your governance. So do check those things out. And now Wilco, over to you, imagining our future.
Right, because there's a lot of buzz on AI. Every talk before us has mentioned it, and we are legally required to do so, aren't we? No, we're not, but
No.
we will, because it's hugely impactful for our guidelines too. So there's a big question around, are some of the guidelines going away? We've seen one recently go away with WCAG 2.2. The parsing success criterion 411 was removed. This was removed not because of AI, but because the browsers made this an obsolete requirement. Browsers fixed this issue for us. But there's lots of potential for other technologies to start addressing accessibility problems. One that is my favorite is language identification. In WCAG, that's under the 3.1.x series. Mobile screen readers already do language detection. They switch to whatever language the text is in. You don't need to identify the language, or rather, you can't even identify the language there. Why don't we have that on the web? It seems like a thing we could have. We're also, video captions is something that's currently, today, built into Chrome. If you go to the Chrome accessibility settings, you can tell Chrome to caption all of your videos. There's problems with it, but here's an interesting question. At what point are these things good enough? When can we say, yes, for this video, it was sufficient? I don't really know how to measure that. WCAG was written with the idea that humans grade all of these things, so it doesn't have any clarifications on what kinds of errors are acceptable errors. And that's something that I think we're gonna need guidance on to figure out. Because if people are going to want to rely on these technologies and rely on them more and more and more, and sure, human eye oversight is advisable for a lot of these things, certainly indicate that the technologies we're at today, but these things just keep getting better. And the same is true for images. AI-generated text alternatives is currently part of the Edge browser. You go into accessibility settings again, you can turn it on, you can request it to give a text alternative to an image. It's built right into there. And there are various alt generator services out there too that will caption your images for you. And so the question becomes not just, is there a text alternative and does it have equivalent information? Is what exactly do we mean with equivalent information? How descriptive is descriptive enough? And is there an upper bound to that too? Like, can an image be over descriptive? You don't really know how to call that based on just the language in WCAG. So I think we need guidance on that space. Glenna, you had a part on VR you wanted to bring in too, right?
I do. I just wanted to mention that I'm the glass half full girl, and Wilco is, I think I describe you as the glass half empty. Is that fair?
I hope not.
And I think that's why we're good together, is that we push and pull on each other and think outside the boundaries. And so, people have been asking me for a number of years now, can you apply WCAG to augmented reality, virtual reality, and extended reality? The answer is yes, you can. We're already doing it. We're already doing it for clients. And you see it in the gaming. So I just wanted to make a quick call out that these are opportunities. Let's not be afraid of them. Let's not be short-sighted that WCAG was only written for web, but take the principles and apply it beyond that. Now, what about your vision about these
Yes,
AI?
so I have been fantasizing about some interesting technology. I think we may be about to hit a complete game changer in the technologies, and it hasn't been brought up in XCon yet, and it's AI agents. I think AI agents have the potential to really change everything we do. And just real quick, what AI agents are, these are tools that can do tasks for you. So these are, you can have an AI agent that searches the web and summarizes some information for you. Any question, anything, just ask it, it'll go get it for you. It could present content from your favorite apps in a design that's adjusted for you. Don't like the YouTube interface? Have it presented in a different way to you. Have it fit what you want. If there's complex, if an interface is too complex, it is stressing you out, it could start taking off tasks for you. You want it to send an email for you. You want it to schedule a meeting for you. You want it to look up train times for you. Have your AI agent do that for you. And these technologies are starting to get released. So it's not super widestream yet, but there's a search engine called Perplexity that's using this exact technology. There's SciSpace, that's a scientific search engine that does a similar thing. There's the Rabbit R1, which got a lot of hype on it recently. There's the Arc search engine. There's Multion. There's lots of organizations attempting to develop this technology. And the way I'm thinking of this technology is these AI agents really are a game changer in assistive technologies. These are not just a tool onto its own. These are a new gateway to information. They let you adjust, give you an interface that fits your needs. You want a chat interface, it gets you a chat interface. You want it to give you options, it can generate options for you. It's also a technology that can adjust content to you. Do you need it simplified? Do you need it to have a particular contrast? Whatever you really need, there's a potential for these technologies to really change a lot. And for us to start getting into a world where maybe I don't need to interface with every website anymore. Maybe I can just have an agent do the stressful, painful thing of needing to learn a new interface and buying and shopping on different web. It's these technologies, it can take a lot of the heavy lifting off of people with disabilities. If
We're
we
at
trust them,
time. We're
if
at
we
time.
understand them.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about the late tech start. Thank you. I'm going to hand it back to Paul.
Yes.
Yeah, just really quick. I'll wrap it up for us. We got a late start due to some technical issues. We apologize about that. We will not be able to answer questions directly in this conversation here. However, if you go over to the Discord channel, we can answer some questions there. There were quite a few good ones, but we appreciate you joining in and learning more about the future of web accessibility guidelines.
Take care, everyone.